Good Tuesday morning, everybody. How y'all doing? I want to take this video to see how people are feeling about something monumental that happened with the Seattle Seahawks about 7 weeks ago. Coming up on 7 weeks since one of the biggest decisions that the organization has ever made. Of course, I'm talking about the Russell Wilson trade. Happened right around 7 weeks ago. We're coming up on the 2-month anniversary. And I kind of want to take the temperature now. Because obviously at the time of the trade, you're going to feel a certain way about it. But then stuff starts happening after the trade. And you may see your perspective changed. Mine, for myself, I can say mine kind of has. So we're going to kind of go through it step by step here, but now that we've put a decent amount of time between us and the Russell Wilson trade, and now that we've seen the team actually spend most of the capital they built up from that trade, and we now have some idea of where these resources have been, how they've been utilized. How do you feel about it now? So, just for those keeping score at home, this is basically the current rundown of the Wilson trade. In that trade, the Broncos received Russell Wilson and a pick that became Ioma Uzazurike, defensive lineman. I think he was, a 4th or 5th round pick? I think it was a 4th rounder. And the Seahawks have received in that trade. We already knew about Drew Lock, Noah Fant, and Shelby Harris, but now we know about Derek Young, Charles Cross, Boy Mafe, and Tyreek Smith. And we are sitting on Denver's 1st and 2nd round picks next year's draft. So we now have some idea of the haul that we got in the Russell Wilson trade. It hasn't fully manifested yet. We're going to need some years to see these guys play, but you can at least see the plan. You can at least see the idea here. And now that we have seen that, I want to see how people feel. Has your perspective changed on this trade? Has your perspective on the decision to keep Carroll and move on from Wilson changed? I'm not all the way there yet, but we're getting there. So, when the trade happened, I didn't like it very much. I said as much in my videos after the trade, but the reason why I didn't like it didn't really have a lot to do with Wilson as a player anymore. There were a lot of things to do with the Russell Wilson experience that I was sick of, and I had voiced those issues many times throughout last season and some during the offseason as well. But when it became clear that there was going to be no massive upheaval of the front office and coaching staff, I ultimately landed on, well, even though I'm not convinced that this is going to work, I think it has a better chance of working than Pete and John pulling off a successful rebuild. So I knew all these things about Wilson. I knew that he was struggling to pick up this new offense. I knew that he was struggling to perform late in games in important situations. The last year and a half, I'm not sure if he has a single game-winning or game-saving or game-tying drive late in the 4th quarter over the last season and a half he's played, which is crazy because he was the guy who always gave you 4 or 5 of those a year, and then suddenly it just gets turned off. But despite all these issues, and I didn't know where the Wilson thing was going to go. I didn't know if he was going to be able to pick it up better. I didn't know if 2022 was going to be exponentially better, or was he just going to continue to be this guy who was all about the deep ball, all about the big plays, all about extending plays, despite the fact that he can't do it the way he used to. I didn't know which way it's going to go, and I don't know which way it's going to go in Denver either. I could see it going either way. I think Wilson could have an amazing season in Denver, and make Carroll and John look kind of stupid for moving on from him. Or I do think that he could continue to be the guy that he's been for his whole career, where there are certain things that he's really good at, but there are also some things he is legitimately one of the worst in the league at. I don't know where it's going to go. And had we kept him, I don't know where it would have gone. But ultimately, I came out thinking, I don't like this trade because you're handing these assets to Pete and John, and I just didn't trust them. And nothing that really happened in free agency really changed my perspective on that. Now, obviously, that has not a lot to do with Wilson, and the free agency we had was more or less okay, given the fact that we don't have a quarterback. We gave out a lot of short-term deals, which no objection to that. I'm not saying it as a negative, but there was nothing that really happened there that changed my mind. However, one thing that happened around free agency that had nothing to do with free agency, but it happened around it, was we started hearing things. We started hearing things about the relationship between Wilson and the Seahawks. And some things were said. And if some or all of the things that we heard are true, then I came to kind of realize that, well, I think we had to trade him. I think there was no other option. We heard things like Wilson is going to expect a market-setting deal for his next contract, which means, $55 to $60 million a year? And we also knew that extension would have to come next offseason because he would be entering a contract year. Wilson's not playing on a contract year, almost certainly. So if you were going to extend him, which you would have had to make the decision at that point, it would have been probably 55 to 60 million a year. And that's easy to believe because it's Wilson we're talking about here. And the way Wilson's played over the last year and a half, he's not worth anywhere near that much. Now, he has the leverage to get it. Any quarterback who's better than, who's Ryan Tannehill or better, basically, if you as a quarterback are better than, I'm not even kidding, if you are at the level or a little bit better than Ryan Tannehill, you can negotiate for whatever you want. But in terms of actually adding value to the team on the football field, he's not worth anywhere close to that based off what we've seen the last year and a half. So there would have been a big gamble on your part to keep him around because you don't know what he's going to do, because you'd be counting on him proving that he's worth that kind of money in 2022. And if he doesn't, then you're stuck with a guy who is going to be harder to trade because of the money, because he's an extra year older, et cetera, or you might just have to then trade him for less. You might have to, I don't even know what would happen at that point. You might have to extend him anyway and just cross your fingers. Like, if that was the case, then I completely understand that, because the evidence indicates he's not worth that money. Not even close, honestly, based off the last year and a half. And then we heard he wanted, more personnel control and roster say and more pull in the front office. He wanted to be able to run the offense and run his own offense like he's LeBron James or something. Like, if that stuff's true, then yeah, you really are kind of being forced to just deal him, because look, I understand it doesn't really matter how good the player is. Some players you might put up with it, but you don't need that kind of guy. You don't need a guy who thinks they should have that much control over their team. So if that stuff was true, I totally get it. And then we even heard some rumors that he was unwilling to sign an extension with Seattle no matter what, and he was going to get out after 2022 regardless. He was probably going to demand a trade, and if we didn't give him what he wanted, he would just fake an injury or something like that. I don't know. But basically, he was indicating, according to some sources, that he definitely wasn't going to resign in Seattle. So we were basically looking at one more year of Wilson no matter what. So between one more year of Wilson and just dealing Wilson now, the choice is easy. Now, we will never know if any of those things are true. Let me be clear on that. We will never know if any of those things are true, and we can't believe anybody. But if they are true, if they are actually true, then dealing Wilson becomes kind of mandatory, because I don't want a player with that kind of power in the organization. I don't want that much money going to a player whose play over the last year and a half indicates he doesn't deserve it, etc. And of course, if he had already decided he wasn't signing a fourth contract with us, then it's beyond trivial. But we'll never know. However, the first big volley post-Wilson has now been fired in this draft. And looking at what we got back, the early returns on that trade, let's break it down, because this is the stuff that can really change my perspective on this trade. It can change my perspective on keeping Pete and John around. So we already knew about Drew Lock. We already knew about Noah Fant. Knew about Shelby Harris. I don't really need to go into that. Drew Lock, he's like buying a lottery ticket. Maybe he'll become a franchise quarterback, but it's like trying to win the lottery. Noah Fant, look, if he has a good next 2 years at a cheap rate, then he probably will be brought back, and you are looking at an elite tight end, because his measurables, his physical abilities are elite. He just needs to actually tap into it and produce like an elite tight end. But he could be that, and he's young enough to where he would be that for an extended period of time. Shelby Harris, I don't think he's going to be around very long, but I think he will be good for us while he's here. At his age, I expect to get 2 pretty decent years out of him, and then that'll be that. But let's talk about the actually really exciting stuff you get from this trade. And I'm talking about the stuff you get in the draft. That's what matters. Okay? It's not... Look, Noah Fant has the opportunity to be a part of this team's long-term future. Absolutely. I would give him better than 50% odds, maybe. But ultimately, the guys who are really going to make or break this trade for the Seahawks are the guys you got in the draft. And we now know the identity of 4 of them, with 2 more coming next year. So here's the breakdown. You've got a left tackle who turns 22 basically halfway through his rookie, more than halfway through his rookie year. So the dude is young. The dude is a primo pass protecting talent and has shown the ability to run block at a very high rate, very successful rate. If Cross works out, the hope and the realistic possibility is that you have yourself a franchise left tackle for the next decade. But we know tackles play for a long time all the time, right? Like Charles Cross, at 20, he's 21 right now. We see tackles play until they're 35. We see them play until they're 40 in the case of Andrew Whitworth. Now, Charles Cross is a guy who one of the draws of him is that his ability to play in space is good. So I don't know if he'll be able to do that for his whole career. But you might be looking at a quality left tackle for 15 to 18 years. We've seen guys do it. We've also seen guys not do it. But you've got Dwayne Brown. You've got Andrew Whitworth. So it happens. Jason Peters is another pretty good one. So you've acquired a guy who should at least be a really good left tackle for 10 years. Could be 15, could be 18 in the best case. Boy Mafe, there's some definite downside here. This is a guy who is potential more than production right now. And he is already 23. Some people don't like that. But there are obvious extenuating circumstances with him. For the record, I'm a fan. I think that you are realistically looking at Boy Mafe and going, this guy should be a starting caliber edge player, like a good edge player for, I'd say, 8 years. Because you're doing the rookie deal 4 years, and then you're doing an extension for probably another 4 years. And then at that point, he's going to be 32 or about to turn 32. And then you might say, okay, at this point, edge players, they start slipping and they become a little more anonymous. But that's, to me, what you're realistically looking at if you're trying to be a little optimistic. And then Tyreek Smith and Derek Young, I don't see a lot with them. I'm going to be straight honest. Tyreek Smith, to me, I could see him having a career in Seattle kind of like Cassius Marsh, where he does a couple nice things, he's okay, but ultimately he leaves after his rookie deal or right around there, and you don't really remember him that well. Derek Young, I could see him making a few plays in Seattle, but I don't think he's going to latch on as a long-term solution. But that kind of stuff doesn't really matter that much. Your 5th round pick, your 7th round pick, we're talking about Cross and Mafe, and the potential returns there are huge. And then you have whatever you get next year, which it'll be a while before we know about that. And if we're being honest, it's going to be a while before we know about this stuff as well. Cross, Mafe, Smith, Fant, Young. I'll even throw Drew Lock in there as well. We don't know the full picture yet, but it's starting to take form. So now that we kind of have an idea here where we know that we gave up Wilson and we have gotten as the centerpiece, current centerpiece, a franchise left tackle for, I'd say, 10 years minimum, and a starting caliber edge rusher for 8 years, let's go with. And what you had to give up was whatever Russell Wilson has left in the tank, which I don't know what it is, but I definitely know he's basically at the end or already past his prime. His prime, 2018, 2019, the first part of 2020, he was, other than, I mean, you could obviously find one or two quarterbacks in each of those years who was individually better, but over that stretch of time, he was probably the best quarterback in the league. He was probably number one over that 2.5-year span. And since then, he hasn't been all that close. The numbers have been pretty good, but the overall performance has been, it hasn't been the same. And if you watch Seahawks games and you're actually a Seahawks fan who is invested in the team winning or losing above all else, you see it too. So knowing the fact that Wilson, he only has, even in the best case scenario, he only has a few good years left, right? And knowing how much money was going into him, knowing that the downside of him actually being noticeably past his prime is already there, etc., etc., I think this trade is now in a place where I can start to really get behind it. And most importantly, based off what we did in this draft, it's within reason to start believing that Pete and John might actually be able to pull off a successful rebuild. And that was my big reservation when we made the Wilson trade. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the relative distaste I had for the Wilson trade initially, it's starting to fade, and it had already mostly faded, but if this goes the way that I think it will go, because I like these guys, Cross, Mafe, Fant, Pete and John may yet make a believer out of me. So what do you guys think of this trade? Has your perspective changed over the last 7 weeks? Has this draft made you reconsider? Let me know. See you guys later. Go Hawks.